sometimes the greatest act of kindness is witnessed by the one person who can change your life forever. Sophia Brooks never imagined that the last $20 in her wallet would become the most important money she would ever spend. It was a chilly Thursday evening in downtown Chicago, and classes had just ended. With a backpack full of borrowed textbooks resting heavily on her shoulders, the 22-year-old college student hurried toward the subway station, already calculating how she could stretch a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and instant noodles until her next paycheck arrived. Tuition had emptied her savings months ago. Her part-time job at a neighborhood bookstore barely covered rent, and every unexpected expense felt like another step closer to giving up on the education she had fought so hard to earn. As she crossed a crowded intersection, a cold wind swept between the tall buildings, carrying with it the smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street cart and the distant sound of traffic. Most people walked with their heads down, focused on getting home before the evening rush became worse. Nobody noticed the elderly homeless man sitting quietly beside an old brick wall, with a worn blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His beard was gray, his coat was faded, and his shoes looked as though they had survived countless winters. A cardboard sign rested beside him, but unlike the others scattered across the city, he never called out or asked anyone for spare change. He simply watched people pass by with calm, thoughtful eyes. Hundreds ignored him. Some glanced at him for only a second before looking away. Others deliberately crossed the sidewalk to avoid walking too close. Sophia slowed her steps when she noticed him quietly rubbing his hands together against the freezing air. She reached into her pocket and felt the folded $20 bill she had promised herself not to touch until next week. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before turning toward a small diner on the corner. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a warm bowl of chicken soup, a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a fresh cup of coffee. Kneeling beside the man, she offered the meal with a gentle smile. "You shouldn't have to spend another cold night hungry," she said softly. The old man looked at her with genuine surprise before accepting the food with grateful hands. "Young lady," he replied quietly, "why would you help a stranger when it looks like you don't have much yourself?" Sophia laughed gently and shrugged. "Because someday, I hope someone would do the same for me." She stood, wished him a good evening, and disappeared into the crowd without waiting for thanks. The old man watched until she was completely out of sight. Then, almost silently, 3 sleek black SUVs rolled to the curb across the street. Several sharply dressed men stepped out, removed their sunglasses, and respectfully lowered their heads before the homeless beggar. One of them spoke in a calm voice that carried just enough urgency to change everything. "Mr. Carter," he said, "it's time to return." The men remained perfectly still until the elderly beggar slowly stood to his feet, brushed a trace of dust from his worn coat, and looked across the busy street where Sophia had disappeared into the sea of evening commuters. His calm expression softened into the first genuine smile he had worn in months. "Did you find her?" one of the executives asked respectfully. Ethan Carter nodded without taking his eyes off the crowded sidewalk. "I did not find her," he answered quietly. "She found me." The tallest member of his security team opened the rear door of the waiting sport utility vehicle, but Ethan remained where he was for another moment. Every expensive suit, every private jet, every boardroom filled with applause suddenly felt very far away. He could still hear Sophia's simple words repeating inside his mind. "Because someday, I hope someone would do the same for me." She had never asked his name. She had never taken a photograph. She had not even stayed long enough to hear him thank her properly. She simply saw someone she believed needed help and acted without hesitation. It was exactly the kind of kindness he had spent almost a year searching for. The drive back to his estate on the north side of Chicago was unusually quiet. The city lights reflected against the tinted windows, while Ethan sat alone in the back seat, lost in thought. Finally, his chief of staff, Marcus Reynolds, broke the silence. "Should I have our investigators identify the young woman tonight?" Ethan slowly shook his head. "No. If she discovers who I am now, then everything changes. I need to know whether her kindness was real or simply one beautiful moment." Marcus nodded, already understanding the unspoken rule that had guided this unusual journey from the beginning. Nearly 11 months earlier, Ethan had walked away from a life that most people dreamed about. After years of building one of the largest technology companies in the country, he had discovered that success attracted attention, but rarely honesty. Every invitation came with expectations. Every compliment seemed connected to his fortune. Every relationship eventually circled back to money, influence, or opportunity. Even the woman he once believed he would marry had quietly admitted that his wealth mattered more than the man himself. That conversation had changed everything. Instead of searching for love inside luxury hotels and exclusive charity galas, Ethan chose a different experiment. He would become invisible. Hidden beneath old clothes and gray hair, he had spent months sitting on different street corners throughout Chicago, watching how strangers treated someone they believed had nothing to offer. Thousands walked past, hundreds looked away. A handful offered spare change, yet almost nobody stopped long enough to see the person beneath the appearance. Until today. Ethan looked out at the glowing skyline as the vehicle crossed the river. Somewhere beyond those buildings, Sophia was probably worrying about rent, homework, and tomorrow's classes, completely unaware that she had become the first person to give him something no amount of money had been able to buy for a very long time. Real hope. He leaned back in his seat and quietly made a decision. Tomorrow, without changing his disguise, he would return to the same street corner and wait to see if fate would give them another chance. The following afternoon, the skies over Chicago were bright and clear, but a sharp breeze still reminded everyone that winter was only weeks away. Sophia finished her morning classes, tucked a notebook beneath her arm, and hurried toward the bookstore where she worked every weekday. Her manager had already warned the staff that holiday sales were increasing, and every extra hour meant a little more money for tuition. Even so, as she reached the familiar block where she had met the elderly man the night before, her footsteps slowed, almost without thinking. He was sitting in the same place, wrapped in the same faded blanket, quietly watching the crowds flow around him. This time, however, there was a small paper bag resting beside him that someone had left earlier that morning. Sophia smiled with relief. At least someone else had noticed him today. "Good afternoon," she said warmly as she approached. Ethan looked up with genuine surprise, although he carefully hid it behind the gentle expression of an old man. "You came back," he replied. Sophia laughed softly. "I walk this way almost every day." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a fresh apple along with a homemade turkey sandwich she had prepared before leaving her apartment. "I made an extra lunch this morning," she said. "I thought maybe you could use it." Ethan accepted the meal slowly, studying her face with quiet curiosity. "You keep giving away things that you probably need yourself," he observed. Sophia shrugged as if the answer were obvious. "Food tastes better when nobody nearby is hungry." Her simple reply left Ethan speechless for a moment. During nearly a year of living among strangers, he had heard countless excuses, promises, and polite words. Very few people had ever spoken with such effortless sincerity. Before he could respond, a businessman in an expensive coat walked past, glanced at Ethan with visible annoyance, and muttered that people should find jobs instead of sitting on sidewalks. Without raising her voice or showing anger, Sophia turned toward the man and said politely, "Everyone has a story we cannot see." The businessman hesitated for only a second before continuing down the street without another word. Ethan noticed that Sophia never tried to embarrass anyone. She simply defended a stranger with quiet dignity. After a few more minutes, she checked the time and sighed. I have to get to work or I will be late again. She smiled apologetically before adjusting her backpack. I hope you stay warm tonight. Ethan watched her disappear into the crowd once more, feeling something unfamiliar growing inside him. She had now returned twice without expecting recognition, gratitude, or reward. Hidden inside his worn coat, his phone vibrated softly. Marcus had sent a message asking whether the experiment should finally end. Ethan read it, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and looked toward the busy street where Sophia had vanished. His answer came almost immediately. No. The real test had only just begun, because tomorrow he intended to discover whether her kindness extended beyond a shared meal and a few compassionate words. The next morning arrived with gray clouds hanging low over the city, and a light drizzle painted the sidewalks with a thin silver shine. Sophia finished an early lecture before stopping at the campus library to print an assignment that was due before noon. When she checked her bank account on her phone, her smile faded. After paying rent and buying textbooks, she had less than $30 left until her paycheck arrived the following week. She quietly slipped the phone back into her pocket and reminded herself that worrying would not change the numbers. As she walked toward the subway entrance, she noticed Ethan sitting in his usual place, but something was different. He was coughing softly into his sleeve, his shoulders slightly hunched against the damp weather. She slowed immediately. You do not look well today, she said with concern. Ethan offered a faint smile. It is only the cold. I have seen worse. Sophia was not convinced. She glanced at the small pharmacy across the street, then looked down at the few bills inside her wallet. For a brief moment she hesitated, knowing every dollar mattered. Then she crossed the street without another thought. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a small package of cold medicine, a bottle of water, and a pair of warm-knit gloves that had been placed on clearance near the checkout counter. These are not expensive, she said, as she handed them to him before he could refuse, but they might help. Ethan stared at the gloves for several seconds. During the past 11 months, people had occasionally tossed coins into his cup without making eye contact, but nobody had ever spent time choosing something they believed would genuinely make him more comfortable. You keep sacrificing for someone you barely know, he said quietly. Sophia smiled as she sat beside him on the edge of the low brick planter. My grandmother used to tell me that kindness is never wasted. Sometimes it changes another person's life. Sometimes it changes your own. They spoke for nearly 15 minutes before Sophia realized she was running late for work. She apologized, hurried away, and disappeared into the crowd once again. Ethan remained seated, watching until she was gone. Hidden beneath his coat, his phone vibrated. Marcus had already transferred several $1,000s into a confidential account reserved for unexpected situations during the experiment, waiting for Ethan's instruction to secretly repay the young woman for every dollar she had spent. Ethan looked down at the unopened medicine in his hands and slowly locked the phone without replying. If he repaid her now, he would never know whether her compassion came from her heart or from the hope of receiving something in return. Across town, Sophia arrived at the bookstore several minutes late and quietly accepted an extra evening shift to make up for the lost time. She never mentioned where the missing money had gone. She simply smiled at the first customer of the day and continued working, completely unaware that someone was beginning to admire not only her kindness, but also the quiet strength she carried through every challenge. Over the next 2 weeks, an unexpected routine quietly became part of both their lives. Every afternoon, almost at the same time, Sophia passed the same corner on her way between campus and the bookstore. Sometimes she carried an extra sandwich. Other days, it was a cup of hot coffee or a piece of fruit she had picked up at a neighborhood grocery store after finding a small discount. The gifts were never expensive, but they were always thoughtful. Ethan began looking forward to those few minutes more than any board meeting he had attended during the past year. Their conversations also became longer. Sophia talked about her classes, her dream of becoming a civil engineer, and the long nights she spent studying after work. She admitted that life often felt overwhelming, but she refused to complain because she believed every difficult season eventually taught something valuable. Ethan listened carefully, asking gentle questions without revealing anything about himself beyond the simple story of an old man who had experienced both good days and difficult ones. One afternoon, as golden sunlight reflected from the tall glass buildings surrounding them, Ethan quietly placed a worn leather wallet on the sidewalk beside the bench before Sophia arrived. Inside were several identification cards that belonged to no real person, a small amount of cash, and a handwritten family photograph prepared as part of his private experiment. He wanted to know what she would do if she believed nobody was watching. When Sophia reached the corner, she noticed the wallet almost immediately. She picked it up, opened it just enough to search for identification, and then turned toward Ethan. "Someone must be worried about losing this," she said. "Maybe they need it more than we realize." Instead of keeping the cash or leaving the wallet where it was, she walked nearly 3 blocks to the nearest neighborhood police station to report the lost property before continuing to work, arriving almost 20 minutes late for her shift. That evening, Marcus informed Ethan that every step had been quietly observed from a distance by his security team. "She never even counted the money," Marcus reported during a secure phone call. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing every word. The experiment he had designed to expose selfishness was revealing something entirely different. The following day, another surprise awaited him. Sophia approached carrying a small paper bag with a shy smile. "I found this at a thrift store yesterday," she explained. "It looked warm, and winter is coming." She unfolded a neatly washed navy blue scarf that had clearly been chosen with care. Ethan accepted it slowly, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. Nobody had given him a personal gift in a very long time without expecting something in return. As Sophia prepared to leave, her phone suddenly rang. She answered with a cheerful voice that gradually faded into concern. Ethan could not hear the entire conversation, but he noticed her smile disappear. When the call ended, she stood silently for several seconds before forcing herself to smile again. "Everything will be fine," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Then she hurried away. Ethan watched her disappear into the evening crowd, sensing that for the first time since they had met, the young woman who had always helped everyone else was quietly carrying a burden she had not shared with anyone. The next afternoon, Sophia arrived later than usual, and Ethan noticed the difference immediately. The bright energy that usually filled her smile had been replaced by quiet exhaustion. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes, and she held a folded letter tightly in her hand, as though she had read it countless times. When she finally reached the familiar corner, she forced a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Ethan greeted her warmly, but before he could ask anything, she sat down beside him with a deep sigh. "Have you ever worked as hard as you possibly could and still felt like it was not enough?" she asked softly. Ethan looked at her with quiet understanding. "More times than I can count," he replied. Sophia looked down at the envelope resting in her lap. "The university sent me a notice this morning. My financial aid has been delayed because of paperwork, and the tuition balance is due in just 5 days. If I cannot pay on time, I might lose my place for the semester." She laughed gently, trying to hide her disappointment. "I've been working extra shifts every evening, but there is no way I can earn that much money in less than a week." Ethan felt an immediate urge to end the experiment. With a single phone call, he could erase every financial burden she carried, without affecting his fortune in the slightest. His hand instinctively moved toward the hidden phone inside his coat, before he slowly stopped himself. If he stepped in now, he would never know whether Sophia's kindness truly came without expectation. Instead, he spoke carefully. Sometimes the hardest days reveal the strongest hearts. Sophia smiled faintly. I hope you're right. She reached into her backpack and removed half of the sandwich she had packed for lunch. You should eat something, she said, as though her own troubles did not matter. Ethan looked at the food in disbelief. Even while facing the possibility of leaving college, she was still thinking about someone else before herself. After a few quiet minutes, Sophia stood to leave for another evening shift. I have to work until closing tonight, she explained. Maybe I can pick up a few extra hours this weekend, too. Ethan nodded while watching her disappear into the crowd. The moment she was gone, Marcus appeared from across the street, blending naturally into the busy sidewalk before stopping beside Ethan. We verified everything, Marcus said quietly. She really is in trouble. We can anonymously pay the tuition before the deadline. Nobody will ever know. Ethan remained silent for several long seconds. His heart urged him to help immediately, but his mind reminded him why he had started this journey. Finally, he answered in a calm voice. Not yet. Give me one more day. Marcus looked surprised but respected the decision. As he walked away, Ethan stared toward the direction Sophia had gone, feeling more conflicted than ever before. For the first time since beginning his search for genuine love, he wondered whether testing a truly kind heart was becoming far more painful than pretending to be poor. The following morning, Ethan arrived at the familiar corner before sunrise, but instead of waiting quietly as he usually did, he found himself watching every person who walked past, hoping to catch a glimpse of Sophia. Hours slipped by. Office workers hurried toward downtown buildings. Delivery trucks filled the streets. Students crossed intersections carrying backpacks and coffee cups. Yet Sophia never appeared. By noon, concern had replaced curiosity. Ethan had promised himself he would never use his resources to follow her unless absolutely necessary. But something felt different. He quietly called Marcus. Do not interfere, he said. Just tell me whether she is safe. Less than 30 minutes later, Marcus returned with a careful report. She is safe, but she did not attend classes today. She worked a late shift last night, then reported to another temporary job before sunrise. She is trying to earn enough money before the tuition deadline. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. Even now, with exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders, she refused to give up. That afternoon, just as he considered leaving, Sophia finally appeared. Her steps were slower than usual, and she looked as though she had barely slept. She carried a small paper cup instead of a meal. I am sorry, she said with an apologetic smile. I could only afford coffee today, but it is hot. Ethan accepted the cup with quiet gratitude. You should have kept it for yourself, he replied. Sophia laughed softly. I already had one at work. Besides, sharing makes it taste better. They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes before Ethan noticed her hands trembling slightly from fatigue. Did you rest at all? He asked. She smiled, trying to dismiss the question. Rest can wait until finals are over. Then she admitted something she had not planned to say. I picked up another overnight shift cleaning offices downtown. It is not glamorous, but honest work is always worth doing. Ethan listened carefully, feeling the weight of every word. Here was someone who never complained about working harder. She simply kept moving forward. Before leaving, Sophia reached into her backpack one more time and placed a neatly wrapped oatmeal cookie beside him. One of the ladies at the bakery gave me an extra one this morning, she explained. I thought you might enjoy it. Ethan looked at the simple cookie as though it were priceless. After she disappeared once again into the evening crowd, Marcus approached quietly. The university deadline is tomorrow afternoon, he reminded him. If nothing changes, she may lose her enrollment. Ethan stared at the cookie resting in his hands, then looked toward the busy street where Sophia had vanished. Every test he had designed had already been answered. She had shown kindness when she had little, honesty when no one was watching, generosity while facing hardship, and hope even when her own future was uncertain. For the first time since beginning this journey, Ethan realized the experiment was no longer about discovering whether Sophia had a good heart. It was about deciding whether he had waited long enough to finally reveal the truth. The following morning, Sophia stood outside the university finance office with quiet determination, clutching the envelope that contained every dollar she had managed to save through countless extra shifts. Before she reached the counter, a staff member called her name with a puzzled expression. "Miss Brooks, could you step into my office for a moment?" Confused, Sophia followed her down the hallway. The administrator opened a file, adjusted her glasses, and smiled warmly. "Your tuition balance has been cleared, and you have also been selected to attend a scholarship recognition ceremony this afternoon. We sent the invitation to your email early this morning." Sophia blinked in disbelief. "There must be some mistake. I never applied for another scholarship." The administrator shook her head. "The selection committee made a special recommendation after reviewing several community service nominations. Congratulations." Still unable to understand what had happened, Sophia thanked her politely and left the building holding the invitation in trembling hands. That afternoon, she arrived at one of the most prestigious conference centers in downtown Chicago, feeling completely out of place among the elegant guests, business leaders, professors, and reporters filling the grand ballroom. She quietly found a seat near the back of the room, convinced she had somehow wandered into an event meant for far more accomplished people. Soft music filled the hall as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with a confident smile, "thank you for joining us as we celebrate young people whose character reminds us that success begins with compassion. Before presenting today's scholarship recipients, it is my honor to introduce the founder of the Ethan Carter Foundation." The room erupted into applause. Sophia looked toward the stage with polite curiosity. The giant screen behind the podium displayed the name Ethan Carter beside photographs of hospitals, schools, and charitable projects across the country. She had heard the name before in business news, but had never imagined she would see him in person. The lights dimmed slightly. Everyone stood. The master of ceremonies smiled once more. "Please welcome Mr. Ethan Carter." A tall man wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit slowly walked onto the stage. His posture was confident, his expression calm, yet something about the way he smiled seemed strangely familiar. Sophia stared without blinking. The elegant hairstyle had replaced the gray wig. The neatly trimmed beard had replaced months of careful disguise. The expensive suit had taken the place of the worn coat. But the eyes were exactly the same. The warm, thoughtful eyes that had thanked her for every sandwich, every cup of coffee, every quiet conversation on a windy Chicago sidewalk. Her heart seemed to stop for a single breathtaking moment. Around her, the audience continued applauding, completely unaware that one young woman in the back of the ballroom had just recognized the man standing under the bright lights. Ethan's gaze slowly swept across the crowd until it found Sophia. Their eyes met. Neither of them looked away. Then, before beginning his prepared speech, Ethan stepped away from the podium, looked directly at her, and spoke the first words that only she could truly understand. "Thank you for seeing me when nobody else did." The ballroom became completely silent as Ethan stepped away from the podium and slowly walked toward the audience. Every camera followed him, yet he never took his eyes off Sophia. She remained frozen in her seat, trying to understand how the gentle man she had shared lunches with on a cold sidewalk could also be one of the most respected business leaders in the country. When Ethan reached her, he smiled with the same warmth she had seen every afternoon beneath the gray winter sky. "Would you join me on stage?" he asked softly. Sophia hesitated before standing, still overwhelmed by everything she had just discovered. As they reached the stage together, Ethan turned toward the audience. "Many people know me as an entrepreneur," he began, "but very few know why I created this foundation. After years of success, I realized it was easy for people to admire wealth. It was much harder to find someone who valued a human being before a bank account." The room listened in complete silence. Ethan continued. "For nearly a year, I lived without my name, without my company, and without anyone recognizing me. Thousands of people walked past me. Some offered sympathy. Most offered nothing at all. Then one college student stopped. She shared her meals when she barely had enough for herself. She bought medicine when she could hardly afford her own expenses. She defended a stranger without expecting applause. She never asked what I could give her. She simply chose kindness." A large screen behind the stage began displaying photographs captured by Ethan's security team during the experiment. There was Sophia offering a sandwich, handing him warm gloves, returning the lost wallet, and sitting beside him during quiet conversations. Tears filled her eyes as she realized those ordinary moments had meant so much. Ethan gently handed her a framed certificate. "Today, this scholarship is awarded not only for academic excellence, but for extraordinary character. Your education will be fully funded through graduation, and if you choose to continue your studies afterward, this foundation will proudly support that dream as well." The audience rose to its feet in a standing ovation. Sophia looked at Ethan with tears of gratitude. "You could have told me the truth," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "I could have. But then I would never have known whether your kindness belonged to me or to my fortune." She smiled through her tears. "I never helped you because I expected anything. I helped because I believed everyone deserves to be seen." Ethan's expression softened. "That is exactly why you changed my life." Months later, Sophia continued her studies while volunteering with the Ethan Carter Foundation, helping students facing the same struggles she had once endured. Ethan often joined her, no longer hiding behind a disguise, but never forgetting the lessons he had learned on the streets of Chicago. Their friendship slowly grew into a relationship built on trust, honesty, and shared purpose, rather than wealth or appearances. Together, they established a new scholarship program for hardworking students who quietly helped others despite having very little themselves. Whenever reporters asked Ethan what the greatest investment of his life had been, he never mentioned technology, real estate, or billion-dollar companies. He simply smiled and answered, "The best investment I ever made began with a sandwich, a cup of coffee, and the kindness of a young woman who reminded me that the richest hearts are often found in the humblest places."